I want to apologize. I know that the title of the novel is Unbearable Lightness of Being, but I use brightness because my point was that there is something very smart and intelligent about learning and language learning in particular. And I also want to apologize that somehow I have tunnel vision when I talk about learning. Learning has many meanings, and the one I can, for example, use meaning like in teaching and learning and so on and so forth. But when I refer to learning, it means something different. So maybe for now, the important thing to differentiate between these different kinds of learning is that more than often we use term learning to refer and explain something else, like teaching and learning. But when learning is itself the focus of research, that's the meaning that I like to emphasize today. So for that meaning, you have a very healthy tradition of research in biology and cognitive psychology. And actually the principle of learning, also called mechanism or principle, is a very simple one. It's based on association or correlation, things in environment that appear or occur together. And I will go back to this a couple of times through my talk. It's also interesting that this very simple principle of learning works in many different levels, from groups of neural cells to organism, to groups of organisms at the group level, and it also works in machines. So now I would like to explain why I am so much interested in language and in learning. So why language and why learning? This is the research team that I work with and lead together with Dagmar Divjak. And my answer of why language would be very different if I wouldn't have this great opportunity to work with them together. I think that one way to explain the importance of language is actually to say, well, it can upset us. And we try to prove that in recent paper that appeared in Journal of Neurolinguistics, where we wanted to interrogate, this doesn't help really, sorry. So we wanted to interrogate whether physiological responses can show how we use language and what is our language knowledge in particular instance. So the background of this research is that linguistic skills typically develop largely without conscious awareness. But at the same time, traditional assessments do not tap very well in this unconscious knowledge. The challenge is quite extensive to actually find the right measurement for this unconscious knowledge, how to access this implicit knowledge. One way to do that is using measuring changes in autonomous nervous system, ANS, and it might hold the key to answer the question. Typical way to approach to this problem is by using eye tracker and pupillometry, but we wanted to approach to this in a rather different way. So why would that matter? Because it will open up new venues for language research. It will tell us and give us better understanding of language acquisition, and it will also open up our understanding to physiological basis of language usage. So the method that we applied, we used so-called biofeedback, also known as lie detector, instead of using pupillometry. So this is our second author, Wei Sun, and we recruited 41 native speakers of British English, and with a little bit of exclusion criteria, no learning difficulties, and no cardiac anomalies, just to have the standard normal healthy response. Additional detail is that more than half of our participants were actually bilingual, and one of them was speaking Slavic language. So the experiment consisted of 40 short speech samples, and they were varied whether or not they contain grammatical errors, whether or not there was an accent or non-accent in like native British English, and we also varied the speaker's gender. The focus was on grammatical errors made on articles. And this is also personally important for me because my mother tongue is Slavic, so I struggle with articles. And I mean, we spent 5 years or more researching articles, among other stuff, and I'm still failing. So despite all the patience by Dagmar and Laurence and a few others who were patiently coaching me how to do this, it's still not there. I'm doing my best anyways. So these samples included various densities of grammatical errors. So it was not just yes or no, but we had some finer measure of number of errors which was turned into percentages or proportions. So the errors could be lower density or higher density. And what we measured is heart rate variability. This is a typical, when you use biofeedback, you actually have many response measures, not just one. And this is the same like with eye tracker. You're somehow overwhelmed with all possibilities that you can do, but heart rate variability is a really good one that indicates stress. The lower the variability of heart rate, the higher the stress. And we also used some bottom-up or empirically driven check and proved basically in the paper, we elaborate that in greater detail, that this is actually a good choice for response variables. So I will stop here and ask Matt to press and to just run those two samples from experiment. Yeah.
I think that culture is one of the areas most affected by globalization. It's hard to say whether it is the positive or negative impact. I think that thanks to globalization, people all around the world listen to the same music, watch the same movies, and read the same books.
Second one. Another one.
The celebration of Christmas starts a week before the main event. We celebrate, we send to the cards, and we go to nativity place. And on 25th of December, we celebrate, we have a dinner, and we meet up with our families.
Okay. How many of you noticed that there are errors in the first speech sample? Can you raise hands? Okay, quite some number. How many of you think that there were errors in the second sample? Okay. So remember your answer, and now we'll go into details of our results. So, and also remember that the lower the variability, the more stressed you are. So main results is actually probably the most interesting one is what happens if you have lower or higher density of errors. So we varied between about 20% up to 60% of errors. What you can see, if you start from 20% and then you move up to about 40%, you get more and more stressed. After that, you just give up and say, well, I don't want to have a heart attack from these article errors. So that's about where it basically attenuates towards the end. Second interesting finding is, although it's not so profoundly different, this difference is significant. You're more stressed if you hear errors from native speaker. Somehow you're more forgiving than if I make article errors, for example, like I probably did a few thousands by now. And finally, to check that this is indeed kind of coherent result, you can also see that there is a strong correlation between mean heart rate and variability in heart rate. This tells you basically that the higher the mean heart rate, the lower is variability. Both indicates stress. So you're more stressed when the heart started to pump faster, and it also varies less. So what are conclusions? Implicit language knowledge can be assessed through physiological responses. Heart rate variability offers a new perspective on language proficiency. By the way, it's quite a cheaper system in comparison with eye tracker, but it gives the same quality of physiological responses. So that's an interesting possibility. This research bridges gaps between linguistics, psychology, and neurobiology. It's kind of important to understand biological underpinnings of language acquisition. It's a viable integration of physiological measures in language studies, and it has also interesting implications for language teaching and assessment. We were a bit surprised that we got so much attention by media throughout the globe, so in Canada, in Hungary, in Turkey, in Norway, Denmark, and so on and so forth. So I hope that I gave you a good explanation of why objectively language is important, because you will be stressed if you hear bad language. There are also personal reasons why I was immediately or quite early attracted to language study and language research. That's not a typical way for experimental psychologists, although, of course, we have psycholinguistics, which has a reasonably long tradition. So, like Trump, for example, who knows many words, I love words. I was very much attracted to creative writing and music. At the end of my undergraduate studies, actually, my first job was creative director in a recording studio. So I decided, when I was towards the end of my undergrad studies, my thesis was looking into relationship between production or text corpora from textbooks in elementary school and production in essays by elementary school pupils. Maybe 2 years after I finished my undergrad studies, I was asked actually to write up a shortened version of my research. And I also learned meanwhile, this is not my translation, this is a professional translator, but whose native is Serbian or Croatian. So I'm still learning, but this is where we are currently. I didn't start my postgrad studies immediately, but a few years later when I did, I continued being interested in words, and I did a study where I used a large corpus of scientific writings and analyzing co-occurrence of words in titles, in abstracts, and in journal names to depict the structure of psychology over roughly 2 decades. I will fast forward through my PhD because that was not the greatest experience, to be honest. I went back to experimental psychology, but I didn't want to run traditional experiment because typical experiment consists of carefully chosen item stimuli that then you measure or confront against some participant's performance. You either measure reaction time or accuracy or pupil size, fixation duration, and other possibilities, of course. But what you establish between input, which is carefully chosen items of any language kind, and then the output is basically a black box. We don't know exactly what's going on in the brain. So I proposed, well, if we use natural language algorithms, they're open books for us. We exactly know what they do. And I proposed that as a parallel to compare among themselves and also with human performance. But the problem why this was not a very pleasant experience is that I really annoyed people from natural language processing and computer science. I was all about errors and faults and things like that, and they were all about success rates and precision and kind of positive outcomes. So they really didn't understand why I'm asking about shortcomings of their algorithms. So this is me towards the end of my PhD. That was in Prague. That was my last attempt to befriend some natural language processing people. I visited Corpus Linguistic Group over there and actually worked closely with their natural language processing team. So I hope that I explain why language is important. So it's both personal reasons and also objectively it is important. I will try to move on and explain why learning might be important. So again, same reasons. Personally, it's important, and objectively, it is also important. So personal reasons, I will try to cover very quickly. Being drawn to experimental psychology and to language in particular, you're doomed to do psycholinguistics. But it's a very peculiar discipline or subdiscipline, if you wish, because it doesn't have theoretical model or theoretical framework. Basically what you do, it's purely experimental. Somehow I think this is coming from generative linguistics, because Chomsky made that critical split saying you have competence and you have performance. Competence is in the realm of linguists. We will theorize, we will propose abstractions, and you guys, you can do, psychologists, you can do performance, you can measure those you can give carefully chosen types that we provide you from our theory, and then you can test them in the lab. So that was really not, we were not somehow not allowed to theorize and to go deeper, but just to accept things as they are. On the other hand, it was also interesting for me that learning theory, which we had in abundance in undergrad studies, was presented as something that is done deal. Especially for higher level cognition, that's something in the past, all questions are answered. And then again, I had talent to annoy people. Professor exactly said the same thing, like it's done, those questions are answered, nothing to see here, move on. And then I asked, but once people really were convinced that Earth is flat, luckily someone re-examined that question. I mean, luckily for us. Why would we close it? There is nothing in science that we could say we cannot use these things, these questions are answered. So it was very interesting. And I was intrigued by learning theory for that reason partly, and also because I saw that it's very healthy and present in biology, in animal psychology, in neuropsychology and other, but not in high-level cognition. So I like to start when I want to share my passion for learning with this quote that it's almost like a law of gravity, it's always in action. And you can find it everywhere. I also like this cartoon, Dennis the Menace. Basically, this is the essence of the type of learning that I like to talk about. This is associative or correlative learning. Somehow animals, house pets, figure out that if they hear a can opener sound, something very important and interesting is coming afterwards. So this is this association. You find the systematicity in an environment, and you basically understand that you work in that environment much better. You adapt to it much better. So what that actually consists of? Basically, you can think about a few elements. Among other things, you have cues and you have outcomes. So you have some signals and you have important things that you care about. Those cues and outcomes can be objects, can be events in our environment, and what you want to infer is how they build their association. A couple of things can happen. So first, if they both occur or if they are both contingent, this association will get stronger and stronger. Conversely, if only Q is present but outcome is not, that the association will flat out. Finally, if Q is not present, basically you can say there is no new information about my important outcome, so there is no need to learn anything. And those are the three situations. And what's important is to understand that there is kind of a positive learning when you confirm your prediction. If there is a bell or can opener, I can expect something exciting. On the other hand, if there is a bell but nothing follows, then I will learn that to not pay attention to that sound completely. So you also have this negative learning, which is why this type of learning is also sometimes labeled error correction learning. You predict, if you make a mistake, then you correct for that error. And that's the basis of it. What I want to stress out now, and we like to stress that many times, but I will do that only once in this talk, is that we don't think that's all to language and all to what we do, cognitively speaking. But it's interesting to explore, to use this simpler algorithm and to see how far can you get. And that's the whole story. It's not all to it. We don't believe that it's all that exists in high-level cognition. On the contrary, but it's really interesting because it's so simple to figure out and to see how far can you get. Because even the most complex learning algorithms, today's large language models or ChatGPT, you can break them down and find the elements of this simple principle of association. It's much more complex. It's have all kinds of creams and cherry on top of creams and everything else. But if you break it down, there are bits and grits in the genome of these learning algorithms that is basically pertinent to this type of learning. And that's also fascinating. So basically, if you use something that is more complex, you can only do better. But let's see how far can you get if you use something that is really steep, this kind of simple. So another way to think about learning is important. I like to go to biology, and they show many times, this is one of the proofs that learning is actually metabolically very costly. And from it, they also conclude that it must be biologically very useful. Why would you burn so many calories and energy if it's useless? Some recent studies also claim that that simple learning algorithm has some advantage. It's favored by natural selection because it's cheapest of all calorie burning algorithms or learning principles, and it also gives us good coordination in our environment. So these are a couple of reasons that you might find in biology. Going to psychology, I like to refer to David Marr. He was a really famous and very important scientist in vision. And he was the first who famously said that there are 3 levels of understanding any complex system. He was referring to vision, but this applies to language as well. So you have at the top level, you have computation, the what question, and why the system does whatever it does. And then the algorithm is how it can be done. And finally, you have how that is implemented in the brain. His personal friend and long-time collaborator, Poggio, well, David Marr died quite young, and Poggio wrote a nice introduction to the new edition, post-mortem edition of this book, Vision, and Poggio said that David, his friend David Marr, would agree that there are 2 more levels to this, to understanding complex system. 4th level is learning, and 5th level is also related to learning. This is how those learning machines evolved in the first place. Sorry. This is now moving up. So if just for a moment to go back and basically make a small remark that linguists would typically sit at the computational level. They're really curious about the question what and why. And psychologists naturally are inclined to answer or to look into questions how, what's the process in this. So this is what one linguist concluded, that concentration of the end result basically neglects the acquisition or learning process itself, and that's not sufficient for explanatory understanding. It's fine for description, if this is where you want to end as a linguist. But even linguists were aware of this missing the learning bit in understanding language. And this is I'm kind of fast forwarding, and this is the kind of the start of collaboration with Dagmar, who opened up all kinds of doors, windows, and ventilations for me, because as being trained as a psycholinguist, I was focused on generative theory, but then she introduced me with usage-based linguistics, which is another kind, much more friendly to psychological input. what they do, they think about language as dynamic systems shaped by usage. This is the first thing that psychologists also like. And they also claim, well, this system is based on all kinds of general cognitive abilities, which also kind of in a friendly fashion belong to kind of, psychologists are also interested into that. This is classification, imagination, and so on and so forth. They also like to discuss cognitive constructs, which are very central in cognitive psychology, like memory and attention. But there is also critical top term to say that there is an emergence of language units and language abstractions through usage. And somehow, very soon, Dagmar and I figure out that actually learning is almost like ideal candidate as an operational definition of what emergence might be. So usage-based linguists were talking about emergence, but they didn't actually explain what that means specifically, what's going on when you say emergence. And learning basically is an ideal candidate to fit that purpose. So this is kind of a partnership made in heaven. Come on. Why? Because psychologists are interested, as I said, and Julia also pointed out, that they're interested in process of learning, and linguists are interested in end result, and they're very, really particular of explaining everything. Like in this tool cabinet, you have morphemes, you have phonemes, you have words, you have phrases. Everything needs to be neat and nicely explained in details. But it's also interesting that psychologists are focused like they're like rats in the maze. They don't look outside that maze very often. So what we can teach each other or learn from one another is basically that end result can help us understand the process itself. So what needs to be learned is an important piece of the puzzle of understanding learning itself. And also understanding the process helps us constrain linguistic theorizing. In particular, it honors cognitive commitment, which is very dear to cognitive linguists' heart. Going back to Poggio, he revised his first thinking about fourth and fifth level. So he published that in 2010, and in 2012 he basically said, well, learning is kind of self-sufficient. It's sufficient as an explanatory model of complex system. And that's an interesting point. So the way we developed our methodology in Out of Our Minds research group is basically we are using different typical techniques from different disciplines. For one, we use corpus-based analysis, which can be then corroborated in computational modeling of learning of these elements from the corpora. And finally, when we tune up our predictions with computational modeling, we can run and test those in the lab, in experiments. So you have kind of independent convergence, hopefully independent convergence of evidence. And I will give you a couple of very short overview of case studies that we did recently. Again, back to articles. We tried to fix me a couple of times, but unfortunately, this is the first very simple prediction. You can say, okay, there are a couple of cues that are typically taught if you look through grammar books. You can have things like, what is the register? Is it spoken or written language? Are there some kind of differences between the two? Is the object or the referent known to hearer or not? Is it specific or not? What's the number, singular or plural? Is it countable? And so on and so forth. So you list those from grammar book, and then you make a really silly prediction saying there is no order in how we are exposed to these things. What are our outcomes are these three articles of English system, and everything is it just happens as it is. So everything is shuffled, so to say. Very soon you see that things get stable. If you look definite article, you see by far the strongest cue is known to hearer, and it singles out. Then you have a trio of things which is unknown to hearer, singular and countable for indefinite article, and then interestingly enough, you get complication from no article or null article because partly is a negative of indefinite article because it has uncountable and plural, and in other part, it also has a strong positive cue of generic referent, which kind of, again, mirrors negatively what you have for definite article, which is specific referent. I hope that this makes sense. This is a very simple prediction, and basically you don't have any prediction. You just see what the system can learn from this. Then I will keep that just to have active in your memory, and then you can kind of refine your prediction. You say, okay, let's assume that we have a second language learner of English. Her first language is non or articless. Some Slavic language or Chinese and so on and so forth. You have many languages that don't contain articles. So what's the struggle? Let's assume that at the beginning that person was monolingual and then suddenly started learning second language. And let's also assume that those cues, we all know in whatever language we have that something is known or unknown to hearer and it's a specific or non-specific. So those things exist. They're probably expressed in different way, but they're there. You just don't have a business of making those or putting the articles in the right place. So what happens then? This is me. Basically what I'm learning from the point when the second language English kicked in is basically that the best predictor for not using article is my first language, because that language doesn't have article. At the same time, it's also not very promising that the best cue for using or the is English. So this is another silly system where you say, okay, I know I should use some articles in English, but I really don't know which ones. And it doesn't look very optimistic because those wiggly curves look stable pretty much. So you need something to kind of disturb the system and make actual learning possible. You see some activity from known to hearer for definite article and same trio here for indefinite, but they're not strong enough. English language, some article should be used is still better. But let's then refine this simple model even further and say, let's assume that I really trust and really like my English teacher. And she was really wonderful, and she taught us many times that specificity is the crucial thing. If something is specific, use definite article and you will be fine. So I said, okay, let's assume that this artificial learner has this reset, that there is a strong association between definite article and specificity. And this is the outcome. And it's just getting weirder and weirder, because now you have both generic referent and specific referent kind of positively associated with definite article. English language is still the best cue for indefinite article, and things are all over the place for no article at all. So you see how gradually you can refine your model and understand better what is the struggle of particular second language learner. In summary, the system is messy. Basically, you don't have simple rules, and you also don't have an ideal cue, because these cues are splitting the system in different ways. They do part of the distinction, but not the whole story. It really doesn't work. Thanks. I can try. Yes, it is, however, it is learnable, and there is something that we can do about that. But the question is why it's so difficult. We believe, and we propose this as our understanding, is that basically we all, as I said, we all know when something is known or unknown to hearer, but as a speaker of Polish or any other typical Slavic language, I don't need to pay attention to that. This is your responsibility as hearer. Somehow in English that is flipped upside down. I need to flag you up that this is known to you, and I'm talking about the cat, not just any cat. So that's the point that we made. Yes? So next, instead of just doing this kind of small-scale modeling of the thing, in principle, you can also do large. And this is another study where we looked into Polish verbal aspect using exactly the same learning principle. Let me try to see whether it is. No? Yes, please. Sorry. So in Polish, you have two aspects. It's similar to English in that respect, but this is highly grammaticalized. And basically, people are taught that there are two infinitives, one for imperfective and the other for perfective. So it's quite different system. And people who are second language learners of Slavic languages coming from Germanic, they struggle with that a lot. So when Dagmar teases me about my articles, I can get back at you with the aspect in Slavic languages. So please, next slide. What we offer in teaching is this spectral pairs, rules, and some contextual chunks that help us, adverbials and such, that can help our learning. But yes, when you go into corpora to do the first bit, corpus analysis, then you see that for most of those verbs, there is no choice. They prefer either one or the other. Basically, you have roughly 1/3 of verbs, a large number of verbs that prefer imperfective, and about 25% of those that prefer almost exclusively perfective. You have, yes, about 11% of those that are distributed evenly. So there is not much choice. And then the question is, how do we learn this system? It must be very difficult. Then you can run large-scale learning, running through whole corpora, and we used really large, like 1 billion word large corpora of Polish, where we extracted 10 million sentences for actual analysis. And what we saw, yes, is that basically everything is very lexical, because you need to really know those verbs which prefer either one or the other. What can help the system, what can refine the system, is those contextual n-gram cues. They don't improve the performance, but they do different. They differ for biased versus equiprobable verbs. As I said, there are 11% of those that are more or less 40 to 60% of occurrence in both aspects. So you have yellow cues, which are fairly strong, that indicate repetition, and then you have green guys, and they are strong cues for imperfective, repetition, of course, and then you have green guys, which indicate not yet or once and for all, which are good cues for perfective. But the best cues on the top, probably is too tiny for you to see, is actually tense. So, sorry. So what we offer is not what we actually need, because we need individual forms. And we also need the tense as the best predictor, because for most part, the only ambiguity is in the past tense. In the future, there is 10 times more chance that you're using perfective. In present, you have imperfective only. So then where the difficulty is that lies in the past. Yeah. Finally, not just that you can do learning small scale, large scale, you can also model individual differences, which we also did last year, in last year published paper. So this started as a kind of fun remark, yeah, from a website, Linguistic Questions or something like that, and where the question was kind of odd. What's the ending of verb form if you have Santa toys in plural? And then the grammar prescribes that you have masculine personal, so-called virile, it's li, and in all other instances you use we. Yeah, but the problem occurs when you have mixed group. So the question is, what do you do then? And the grammar and naive users or native users of Polish, they tend to disagree. But the grammar says only if you have one masculine personal referent, you should use li. But people actually say if you have any masculine animate referent, you should use li. So there is a kind of mixed story. What we did, we used a sample of English native speakers who didn't know anything about Polish, and we exposed them to learn simple Polish sentences, which were also kind of augmented with pictures presenting animals, people, and different cues which were visual and supported learning. So we wanted to see how and whether people who never learned any Polish can figure out these differences and how well they can associate those cues in rather quick time. So what we found out, is that the model prediction and participants' behavior fit really, really well. So if you look different combination of possible cues, you see that basically what model silly machine predicts is something that humans also tend to do. Interestingly enough, contrary to this kind of misogynistic Polish language, please, female did much better. So they fit the model much better, and they actually won, please. Yeah, so I think it's a nice point, like the fact that language usage counteract the implicit misogynistic trait of Polish language. So next, what we plan to do is to do a replication study using EEG and same experimental setup that is to come. And I hope I managed to answer both questions to why language is important and why learning is important, especially for my own research. At least I hope I convinced you that I don't do too crazy stuff, but these things are really interesting. Yes, I want to thank all my past and present collaborators throughout the world. I want to thank the University of Birmingham, my school and my department for all the support and opportunities that I have. I also want to give special thanks to my family, especially to my son, and then to Dagmar, who is my great friend and also who made this research being so much fun. Thank you.